Good afternoon, everyone. For those who are in the UK and for those who are in Brazil as well, it's already 1 p.m. in Brazil. I'm so excited to welcome everyone to this event. That is the last event of the year of our STEM Education Hub, which is a project that has been co-created, co-funded, and co-managed by the British Council in Brazil and King's College in London. And it's been a very successful project, and I am super happy to say that this event this year, the last event of this year, is one very special. And it's very special particularly because we have two experts in assessment for learning, one from Brazil and one from the UK, that I know really well. And I'm delighted to present to you. One is Chris Harrison, Professor Chris Harrison, Professor in Science Education here at King's College. She has decades of experience doing research in assessment for learning in England. She has worked with Paul Black, Dillian William, and then she's still working with science with AFL assessment for learning, particularly in STEM education today. So I want to welcome Chris, and I also want to welcome Lilian Basicki. That Lilian she also has like a very extensive experience in assessment for learning and in active education as well. She's a director at the Triad Educacional in Brazil. She has a PhD from the University of São Paulo in educational psychology, and she will also talk to us about her experience, her research in assessment for learning. I know that all of us will enjoy it very much, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions to ask. So let me just share with you very quickly how we're going to structure this presentation today. Chris Harris is going to present first. Then when she finishes, we're going to open for 1 or 2 questions only before we move on to Lilian. Then when Lilian finished her presentation, then we will open for more questions. We're going to have about 30 minutes of discussion. Lilian and Chris are also encouraged and invited to ask questions to each other, because this is going to be a sort of round table. But the audience, all of you who are here today, obviously you can ask questions writing on the chat. But if you really want to ask a question, if you want to open your mic, please do. In terms of interpreters, you can listen to the presentation either in English, in Portuguese, or in both languages. So if you can only understand English, you just click on the globe at the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation, and choose the English channel. And I will speak in Portuguese now so that everyone who doesn't speak English can understand. Pessoal, para quem só fala português,
so folks, if you only speak Portuguese and you want to hear English or Portuguese, you can click the globe icon in the lower part of your screen. You have an interpretation menu there. You can choose your Portuguese channel or English for that matter, and then you can just remain in that channel the whole time. I'll come back to English now.
Thank you everyone for being here today. This is super exciting, and I can't wait to hear from Chris and from Lilian talking to us. I will hand over to Claudia Freeland. Claudia is from the British Council, and she also wants to say a few words to you. Claudia.
Thanks, that's good. Hi, everyone. I'll be very quick on my introduction because we have a very good event and agenda today. So it's an enormous pleasure to be here. I'm Claudia Freeland. I manage the schools portfolio in Brazil, which basically means the STEM education portfolio. So the STEM Education Hub is part of our portfolio in Brazil, and it's as Arthur mentioned, it's a joint initiative with King's College London. So the objective here is exactly what we're doing today. So it's to promote cooperation and exchange knowledge on STEM education between Brazil and the UK. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and I think I'll hand over to Professor Chris Harrison, I think.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's always useful to discuss with other researchers and with teachers about assessment for learning, because I think it's something that has grown over the 20 plus years since Black and William did their review in 1998 to be not only just an important part of assessment, but a pedagogy, a way of teaching that has benefited both teachers in terms of finding out more about their students, but also particularly for students in terms of them doing better, in terms of them improving their understanding, in this case, in STEM education. I'm just going to switch on, share my screen so you can see where I've actually done a presentation for you. Let me just put this on. I hope people can see my screen. Yes, Arthur?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, good. So I thought about how I would do this, and I always think it's interesting when we talk about online learning and online education, because I've been in this game of assessment now for a long time. This is my 34th year at King's, so that's a very long time to be looking at a particular area of research. And I've been waiting really for online assessment to really take off well. There's been various bits, but not doing so well. And I actually thought after the pandemic that, you know, with teachers actually working more online, that we'd see more work on online education, on online assessment, online education. And I think it is coming in some small parts, but it's not there, certainly in the UK, as a regular part of what teachers do in the classroom. They seem to have reverted away from using the computer to actually working very closely with students face-to-face in the classroom at the moment. But we've got to look ahead, always with assessment. We've got to learn from what we've done in the past, be aware of what we're doing currently, but also be looking ahead to what might work. And I think that online assessment has got great potential that we need to really encapsulate and understand in order to do it well. So I'm going to do in my presentation, before we move on to somebody who's more expert in the online assessment arena than I am, I'm going to actually look really closely at how does assessment for learning work and how does feedback work in the assessment for learning classroom, because I think that understanding that will give us that insight into how we might do online assessment better, how we might do online assessment for learning better. So just as a historic bit, just so people know some of the work that has gone on, in 1998, as I said, Black and William, Paul Black and Dylan William, did their famous review of formative assessment. And here at King's, we wrote this small booklet based on their 70-page research article. And that small booklet of 20 pages was called Inside the Black Box. You can see it there on the screen. We then did a study with 36 teachers, 12 science teachers, 12 English teachers, and 12 mathematics teachers in 6 schools. And we looked at how those ideas in the review that Black and William did, how they might be interpreted and carried out in the classroom. And this was an 18-month study where we spent 6 months where teachers trialed various things, and then a whole year where they actually tried it out with, supposed to be with one class, but teachers are teachers. They tried it out with several of their classes, some of them, because they found it useful. But they carried it out with particular classes, and we looked at how those classes performed compared to classes that hadn't had this extra assessment for learning, professional learning that these teachers had done. And that's when we wrote our second of our actual small booklets for teachers, the grey one there, called Working Inside the Black Box. This is where we learn from teachers, and very much our work is based, we call it close to practice type research. It's based very much with teachers, where we work with teachers and tell them some of the ideas that we formulated from research papers and so on, and then they then take it into the classroom. We learn from how they put that into practice. So that was a very important part of setting up this research. And then shortly after that, Paul Black and I wrote Science Inside the Black Box. Dylan William and gosh, I've forgotten his name, and another colleague wrote mathematics inside the black box, and so on. Jeremy, who's now at UCL. And then many projects followed. And so I want to pick up on this idea from the original projects and from these many projects that we've done over the last 25 years to see really what it is that's important to make assessment for learning work well in classrooms, because that's what we'll need for making online assessment for learning work well. Just for those who are clear, the black box is really about, it's an analogy from electronics. Paul, Dylan and myself come from a science background originally. And so we had this analogy of the black box being the black box in electronics. And that means the classroom. We know a lot about inputs to the classroom. We know a lot about the outputs, the examination results, and so on. What we don't always know is what goes on inside the classroom. And of course, as educational researchers, as STEM education researchers, that's where we really need to focus. And that's what I want to do today. So if I just do a few definitions so you can see where it is. Interestingly, when I wrote this PowerPoint, I suddenly realized the word feedback, which is what assessment for learning works on, is not actually there within our definitions. It's the actual part that gets everything to work. It's feedback from students to teachers about how students believe something actually plays out within STEM. And then it's the way that teachers work with that to change that thinking. It's that feedback, that reciprocal feedback between student and teacher and student that's important. But here we have this sort of gem of what's going on. It's about bringing about improvement, and teachers and learners need to be involved, but ultimately it's the learner who has to take action. Other people have defined it as well. Here is Belle Klonowski from Australia, and her group defined it very much in a little bit more detail by saying that it's when teachers and peers reflect upon and respond to that evidence that's there within the dialogue, within the interactions that happen in the classroom. And it's from when teachers observe what's going on and decide what to do next that enhances the ongoing learning. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at teachers really trying to find out, what do children know? What do children partly know, and what don't they know? And then thinking, so what's the next steps? And clearly on our first project and on many of our projects since, teachers, being very smart people, realize working on what they partly know is probably the way forward. So can I find out, what do children partly know in their thinking? What can they reveal to me by the activities they do and the answers to the questions that I give them? What can I find out about their thinking? And when I find that out, what can I then do to move their thinking much more towards what we'd see as the important areas of science or mathematics or engineering? I just want to have a look at this model that Dylan William put in his 2014 book called Embedded Assessment. He has this idea that these aspects are all important, that we need to get all of those aspects working in order for formative assessment to work. That's why he calls it unpacking formative assessment. But when I work with teachers and show them this model, I've only just realized in recent years that they find it hard to do when all the parts are there. If you focus on each one, if you do unpack it, as Dylan suggests in his book, it actually helps them much more. So I'm going to do that now, because I think this will actually help us with this idea of how does feedback work. So one of the things that teachers are very aware of, and one of the things that was put in the EEF, the Educational Endowment Fund here in the UK's report on how to make science education better, is what teachers should be doing is providing feedback to learners to move learners forward. It's when we look at their maybe homeworks that they've done and we give them written comments to say how they might improve. It's how we might guide them forward. And that is an important part of it, but it's only one small part of it. And if you remember, it's getting all of the aspects to work that really helps. And I hope to explain that as we go through. So let's just take a step back from that a moment, because this is really where we start. At the moment, Arthur, myself, and other colleagues at King's College are working with new teachers new to the profession. And one of the ideas that we've been working with them on over the past few weeks is, how do you elicit evidence of learning? How do you find out what kids know and partly know and don't know when you work with them in the classroom? Because when you work with that, then what you actually find is, as they speak to the teacher and to one another in groups, they start to activate other students as learning resources for one another. It's what Margaret Heritage talked about in her 2007 paper, when she says that, you know, students are really important resources for one another. They have an idea and they will then compare it with another idea that a student has got and weigh up whether their initial idea is a good one or not. If they try and do that with a teacher, they just try and take on the teacher's idea because the teacher's the expert. And so their idea just gets left there and doesn't get dealt with. Two students talking about their partial ideas is a better way really of helping them move forward, because they then pay great attention not just to what the new student's idea is, but also to their own idea. And they start to think, oh, maybe I could change that a little. Whereas when they go for the teacher's idea, they try and replace it, and then later maybe can't quite remember the detail of what the teacher said. So Margaret Heritage talks about this being very important in terms of taking assessment for learning forward. The other thing that happens is, as you start to get students more involved in the assessment in the classroom, they start to become owners of their own learning. And this is one of the parts that we find hard to explain to our new teachers, that you really need to make all your students active in their learning. Some students naturally do it, but many of them just sit there and wait for the teachers. In fact, in our initial study way back in 1999, when I went round and asked students about who do we do assessment for, they never mentioned themselves. They say, oh, we do it for our teacher. We do it for our head teacher. We do it for our parents. All right. When I said, isn't it useful to you? They went, no, it's something that's done to us. And we have to move students away from that, from thinking about assessment is something that others do to them, to assessment being something that provides evidence for them to help them move forward with their learning. We're trying to move them more to be a self-regulated learner. I explain this to our new teachers by saying, really, you are trying to get students to eventually learn without you. You are saying to students, I want you to be able to learn. I want you to know what to take from the guidance I give you and what you hear from other people say, and use that to help you learn better. And again, our new teachers find that difficult, but they start to get it as we move forward, and they see it working in experienced teachers' classrooms. So what do we do? The sorts of things we do is introduce them to good questioning techniques. So we've got a series of different ways of doing this through looking at new versions of revised versions of Bloom's taxonomy, to using Brenda Keogh and Stuart Naylor's concept cartoons, one which you can see on the screen now, to using things like hinge point questions. If we just look at this concept cartoon, which is one, I'm sure it's a bit of science that you know well. The idea is that, you know, if we put this coat on the snowman, will that help? Will that make him melt more, or will that stop him melting, or whatever? And the important one is the girl in the bottom corner with a question mark, because the question you ask students when you put this up on your whiteboard is, what do you think? All right, it's not who's correct, it's not who's right, it's not who's got the best answer, it's what do you think? Because this is what assessment for learning is about. It's about activating the classroom with activities so that the talk that comes out allows students, hear the girl in the yellow at the bottom, to think about, yeah, what do I think? What do I know about this? What can I say about it? And in doing that, it both helps the other children in the classroom know about their thinking and compare it with what that girl is thinking. And out of that talk, the teacher can start to collect that evidence of what do they know and what do they partly know and what they don't know, to decide on what to do next. So this is a really important part, this feedback moving between students, from teacher to student and from student to teacher. So going back to our Dillon-William model, we start off with this. We probably are going to be doing the feedback because teachers mark books and give feedback on work that children do. But it's getting those other two, that activating students as learning resources for one another and activating students as owners of their own learning. It's then that you start to get assessment for learning to work. And of course, over time, we've come up with various ideas to actually help with those. Oops, that should come up there. With the idea that things like setting up learning intentions, making sure that everyone is involved in what goes on. And that becomes the eventual model that William came up with in 2014 with Marnie Thompson. So it's this unpacking that's important. It's working on all of those areas and not just focusing on one, not just focusing on that brown area in the top corner. The others are important. But does it work? Well, here we've got a piece from a paper by Constant Ate, who did a study in 10 comprehensive schools in, I think it was Northern California, certainly was in the US. And what he was looking at was what happens when you've got experienced science teachers. How are they using questioning? And if questioning is at the heart of assessment for learning, they need to be using questioning well. Well, here, if you look at it, you can see from what he writes, actually, I don't know if Constant is a he or a she. Constant is probably a female, or what she writes possibly, is that you find that they are asking questions to find out about student thinking, but in actual fact, the focus is on the verification of factual knowledge. It's trying really to adjust what students say, so they say the same thing as the teacher. It's not based on looking at students' ideas and student thinking. That's minimal. And if you pick out parts from that particular paragraph, which I took from her paper, you'll see that they are doing strategies to notice, elicit, and respond to students' ideas, but it's all based really to get them to say the right response. So it's really drilling and directing the learning rather than doing what Dylan William was suggesting in that 2014 book, which is to unpack it and to make sure that what we're trying to do is to really find out what students' thinking is and to change that thinking to help them improve. And at the same time, developing those students as learners. That doesn't come up at all in the Ate paper. There are other papers that have picked up on that more recently. So here is a scoping review that was done in Australia by Arnold more recently. And what she did was to look back through 10 years of studies, the previous 10 years of studies, 75 studies in all, to find out really how do students view assessment for learnings. So if we're saying that it's both teachers and students that have to be involved, that was there in the original Black and William idea. But it's actually thinking about, so how do students receive this and what do they do about it? And what she actually found within it that in those 75 studies, that there were aspects that were there that help build student assessment literacy, that help build student disciplinary identity, so their STEM identity in the case of STEM learning, and student agency. But they were very few. There was about 5 papers out of the 75, and most of those came from Australia and New Zealand. So I think what Arnold was suggesting in her recent review was we've got a way to go, both Ate in the 2015 paper and here Arnold in the more recent review, say that as teachers, we've got some way to go. We might be working well on getting assessment for learning strategies working, but maybe we're not doing so well at really looking at student thinking and getting those feedback loops to be based on student thinking. So what can we do about that? And here, she goes on in that paper to pick up on various studies from various countries to suggest that AFL is more teacher-centered than maybe we need it to be. Maybe we need assessment for learning to be more student-centered so that we can actually try and get students to take a more growth-orientated approach to their own learning. At the moment, many students, as Harris says in her 2018 paper, are too willing to go along with a teacher-centered approach. It's an easier thing for them to do because they don't have to question themselves as learners, and that's one of the things that we want them to do. So coming back to our model that we had at the beginning, I think this is important. I think if we're going to get online assessment to work for assessment for learning, we need to pay attention to all 5 of those areas, but particularly to the grey and the light blue one, to activating students as learning resources for one another, and especially for making students active learners and active assessors in what they do. And I think that's really where we're at with the various projects that we've looked at. And what I'm going to be interested in as we move forward is to hear what things are like from a Brazilian perspective, but also from others, particularly teachers who are listening in, to see whether they get a similar idea to what's going on in their classrooms. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, Chris. Thank you so much for that. Great overview of where we are in terms of assessment for learning in the world, not only in the UK. I'm sure some people would like to ask questions. Maybe Lillian, I should start with you. Maybe you would like to ask a question to Chris, or before you can start your presentation, or if not, I can try to get someone from the audience as well. Can I encourage colleagues who are online to add questions, written questions on the chat, or if you prefer to just open your mic and ask a question directly to Chris, please do so. Lillian, would you like to ask any questions? Sorry.
Eu achei muito interessante essa discussão.
I think that this discussion is very, very interesting about how important it is for the students to understand this entire process of this assessment process. It's not something coming directly from the teacher to the student, but that it could be a two-way street, coming and going. So I believe that my question for Professor Chris is related to that. How have you been seeing in the studies the participation of the students when it comes to this assessment among peers? How has this been happening? And we know that it's different depending on the age group, but what have you noticed when it comes to this? Thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful presentation. It was very, very good.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I think you're right. It does differ with age. So we had 2 big projects from 2012 to 2017 in Wales, where we were working with primary age children, so children from age of 4 up to age 11. And what was really interesting was that the teachers of those children worked really hard at getting the children to work together. So strategies like think, pair, share, strategies like if you have done a piece of work, it might be a piece of writing that a 7-year-old has done, you check it with your neighbour before you go to the teacher. So they're encouraged to work together more collaboratively. When we look at the projects we've done in high school, so 11 to 19, we find that's there less. Peer assessment does happen, but it's usually that they've not worked together. They've simply done the work separately, but they come together to look at the product. And often, some classrooms it works. They persuade students to go back and improve. But often, once a student in that age group has completed a piece of work, it can be difficult to persuade them to have a second go to improve on it. So they might be told and guided what to do, but they don't have the practice of doing it. I think that's a big difference here in the UK between what goes on in primary schools and what goes on in high schools, that it's very much working in pairs and working with others in primary. That's not a common practice in secondary. Assessment becomes a very solitary pursuit in secondary quite often, and we look at individuals and classes rather than looking at groups. And I think that's something we maybe need to refocus.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Lillian. So I've got one question from Jess Hamer that came up. So I will ask this question before we can move on to Lillian's presentation. Okay. So she asks, has this been explored in terms of likelihood to progress into post-compulsory STEM education? I can see lots of implications for self-efficacy here. Chris?
Yeah, so can I. I don't know if anybody's actually done that study, though. Yeah, I don't. That's quite interesting. I don't think anybody's actually looked at if learners are actually more aware of their learning by the time they get to, say, age 16 or age 18. Do they then encourage them to go more into that subject? That would be interesting to know. I can only think from, and this is just thinking of one of our original teachers, Paul Spencerley, and just the way that he talks about his students and how they use the ideas that they build up within their science assessment for learning classrooms, how they use it within other classrooms, and how it actually helps them. They are more aware of being a better learner. And he talks about, you know, how proud he is of those students going on to be doctors or engineers or technicians or whatever. So I think possibly for some teachers it does work. I don't think anyone's actually ever done that study. It'd be an interesting study to do, to see whether it does encourage them to stay within STEM. If it does, then maybe we'd get an extra boost for assessment for learning. Maybe it's something we should do.
Yeah, can I just say something to, particularly for colleagues in Brazil, because I know AFL, Assessment for Learning, is so much used in England, and I know it's more than in my experience in Brazil. And what I find fascinating about AFL is how much it changed the dynamics of the classroom. It's the relationship between the students and the teacher, the rapport between us. That changes. Like they are more open to reveal what they know and what they don't know, and they, in a way, once they know what AFL is for, linking back to Chris's presentation, they actually realize, oh, hang on, actually, I can help myself and help my teacher by revealing, by telling more of how much I've been learning, because I can be more supported by my teacher. And yeah, so this is maybe a message really for my colleagues in Brazil to really try to use more AFL if you're not doing it yet. Yeah. So wonderful. Shall we move on to Lilian's presentation? And then after that, please take note of questions if you want to ask questions to ask at the end. And then Chris and Lilian, I'm sure you will want to ask questions to each other as well. Okay, Chris, Lilian, with you now.
Muito obrigada, Arthur.
Thank you very much, Arthur. So it's a great joy to be here with all of you, to receive this invitation, to share a little bit of my experience. There's no doubt in my mind that it's still very incipient when it comes to this entire presentation given by Professor Chris. I became really, really excited about your presentation, the results of your AFL studies, and what I'm going to share with you is a result regarding practice of implementing STEM in Brazil. We have been defending STEM in Brazil plus the arts, okay? STEM plus A for arts, and I'm going to share my presentation now so that we can have some discussions. We have 25 minutes, and I have, oh my gosh, I have so many things to say. Am I going to be able to say everything within 25 minutes? So I summarized everything, and I am going to share some points with you. And I'm really excited so that after my presentation, we can share stuff, and so that we can reflect upon everything that I'm going to share with you. So I added some keywords in my slides in English and in Portuguese, and I hope that you're going to be able to follow it. Arthur has introduced me, but I wanted to share my publications with you, and it's a great honor to be able to share this with everybody because they are publications that were born in Brazil when we were discussing this systematics a lot, but we had no publications in Portuguese. So we have Hybrid Teaching. This was the first book published in 2015 to deal with this approach, with this combination of all of the online and face-to-face experiences. And I want to base my presentation on that, and I'm going to complement that and add to what Professor Chris mentioned. We have active methodologies. I organized this book as well, and it's widely used in Brazil, mainly for public exams, for teachers, professors, so that they can start teaching at our public schools in Brazil. And the last book, and so the feeling that we had no publications on STEAM here in Brazil, STEM plus the arts, how to implement STEAM in Brazil based on the national curriculum that we have in Brazil. And so this is new in Brazil, and more we can understand how the students can learn, can have a supply of experiences that are truly meaningful inside the classroom. And they do not have to be a dessert, they can be the main dish. And so these experiences can reach the objectives that must be achieved. So I'm going to first discuss the authentic assessments and integrated projects. So when we analyze the STEAM, and so if you only came to this event without knowing about STEAM, STEAM is an acronym that we deal with as if it is an approach. It involves the sciences, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, okay? Arts and design for us, that's what the A represents. And every time we take the STEAM into our classrooms, we try to establish a connection with the learning based on projects. So when we analyze the learning based on projects as an active methodology and we use the STEAM, it makes a lot of sense to us because it makes that learning very meaningful. But now we have the main focal point, which is it makes everything more meaningful, but it also presents a challenge. How can we assess the learning here when we have a learning that is many times now actively participating, hands-on, studying the means?
So it all becomes a great challenge. And I brought you an example here about this just to explore a little bit more of what we have been doing around here, which is an implementation of STEAM in a medium scale, but it's increasing more and more in public network schools, public schools here, especially in the local level. So here the students would see this this piece of real estate here that was being used as just a garbage deposit. So you had a lot of debris. This is a very vulnerable region of the city, and the space that was a public space was being used just as a trash dump. And this provoked an integration with those contents and that those learning experiences that the teacher there of this classroom full of 5-year-olds could work. So that involved the identification of the kind of garbage that we could see there in that spot. So they talk about it too. So it would include questions such as, do you believe you might use this area for something else? And the community itself was responsible for bringing new points of view, and the parents, their families, they could suggest, well, we could use that space for some physical activity or for some relaxation, some leisure, such as a playground there. So the people from the community themselves were suggesting new activities, and the students started elaborating on what that space could be used for. So we had a whole investigation process done, and they would identify what would fit that area in that next to the school. And when they did the whole process, each step of it would involve those knowledge areas in a very significant way. So they would see mathematics and geometry, and they would study issues related to empathy with the community. So let's understand and see how we can build something new here, not only for us, but for people who live here around the school. And this led to the development of this prototype. So they developed this prototype here, and this is in a miniature representation of how the land there was set up. So they created some steps there because they had an incline there. So they presented their own project to the responsible, to the person, the representative responsible for the legislative branch here at the municipality. So they brought that to the town hall, and the town hall, the mayor awarded this project, which was implemented in this school. So it was awarded so the students could bring their project to the mayor, and the mayor decided that he would actually look into it and build something in this piece of land next to the school. So this is just for us to analyze and see that in order to think about a project that involves different areas of knowledge, it is fundamental to have the clearance of mind of the objectives of learning and what objectives should be analyzed, assessed in each one of those stages of this process. Because many times when we think about a school culture that is historically here in Brazil, and for sure elsewhere in the world as well, we didn't privilege the active learning as we try to do now, and as we understand that is fundamental to do now. It's paramount to do that in the 21st century, to adapt to this new reality. So our challenge is to think, how can we use such an activity, such a proposition that took, it lasted months, you know, to it lasted months, and it took us months to understand their learning and to support their content creation regarding those learnings. I think my internet connection is a bit unstable here. Is it back? I'm back. Okay. So how can we follow along the students from a clear design of learning objectives? So this is not new in education, but is still a challenge, you know, to look to those objectives within the different complexity levels of each one of them. So it is very common to, when we see the high school students, for instance, the students will say, well, the exam that I took was harder than the class itself. The class was way simpler, because sometimes the teachers are worried about delivering the same class for everybody, which is the principle of equality but not equity. So they run the risk of not advancing in the levels of complexity within that same subject. So they stay in the first levels of it, so they don't advance forward. And when we speak about an assessment for a STEAM project, having the clearance of mind of those objectives is paramount. So for that, we stimulate the professors to build their planning with that backward design in mind. That is, to be clear about what are the central ideas, what are the big ideas that are essential for my students to learn in order to have an experience such as this one that I showed you right next to a school. Because sometimes for their families and sometimes for the students themselves, it's not clear what they're learning from that. So in order to build you have to build a planning process in order to be clear about where you want to go with each one of those assessments that you design, which ideas are central, and then you can think about what kind of evidence should I collect in order to proceed. So when we speak about the online world, those evidence can be even more diverse. So when you deal with that in person, they are very diverse, but online way more diverse, because the idea is that if you are clear about your objectives and the evidence that you need, then you can think about your learning experiences. And just like Chris said, and it was very inspiring to hear that reflection, how important it is to not have that only in the hands of the teacher. And my question to Chris was towards that subject, because that's a difficulty that we face. The older the students get, the less they want to support, meaning if they give feedback to a colleague, sometimes they are not being friendly enough to them, right? So they're saying, hey, you didn't go too well. So they have to always say, oh, you're doing great, everything is okay. And with the younger kids, the experience is pretty much the same. So for child education in the early childhood, from 5th to 6th year, even 7th year, which is 12-year-old, we still can have this critical view specifically with a certain sincerity of mind, saying, hey, look at your project, and this action can be different, and this can be done better. But the older the student, the harder it gets. And luckily, I work a lot with training for teachers, and when you get to training for teachers, many of the teachers are more collaborative in this peer feedback. So this is something that we understand that we still have to develop a lot during the final years and with high schoolers, and also the first years of graduation, undergrad. We feel that difficulty, especially when you deal with an undergrad level that is not in the area of education. Those who study education are more open to feedback, it seems. So the idea is that in order to think in the assessment, you have to be clear about your objectives, your fundamental objectives, and you have many digital resources. Here I have in Padlet some of the resources. Some of them are in Portuguese, so my colleagues from Brazil who are watching will be certainly very well served by this. But of course, you can just click the link and you can use this to get in touch with all of them in English as well. Here we have some resources that we used, and many of them can have a very interesting view in terms of evidence collection for learning. So when we use Padlet or when we use other resources, we have Collabskip, for instance, which we used more recently with adults, still not with students, but with teachers. That helps us to collect evidence as well. And this example that I would like to bring to you is from a workshop that we offer to some teachers here in Brazil. And in this workshop, during the process, each adult would leave evidence for us about each step of the way. So we used some questionnaires, broad questionnaires, very comprehensive questionnaires, and more specific questionnaires as well. I think my connection was oscillating again, but I'm still here. So some more broad, comprehensive questionnaires, but also using thinking routines. So they are very much connected to the snowman format, right? So the students would make visible their ideas to the teachers, right? So they would have to reply to, for instance, what do you see in this image? What do you think about this image? And what do you ask yourself in regarding to this image? So when you work with the students about the thinking routines, you can realize that slowly those ideas will become more evident for the students themselves. So this is a digital resource. This is the Scrambler that I use a lot with adults, especially, which is basically a board. And when you see a news piece, for instance, you ask students to say, hey, what do you see in this article? And they are very objective. What do you think when you read the news? And And then what do you ask yourselves from it? And what we are most interested in is the third column, which is when they start to ask themselves about what they see, because those thoughts also make visible that they have some gaps in their learning. And the online world, especially after the pandemic in Brazil, more specifically, but I know that all around the globe we have that. It makes us very much worried about those gaps, those learning gaps that we have to fill out. So using a thinking routine, for instance, is one way to access what the students think. And by accessing that, you have better ways of intervening, or even, as Chris said, to help the student realize what are their own difficulties and how can they themselves participate in the process and not only passively receive something from the teacher. So the routines we use here, we use the Project Zero's Thinking Routine Toolbox. So I think many of you already know this, but we have routines for different moments of the classroom. So we have routines for introducing a new idea to synthesize and to go deeper in the idea, and also different thinking routine groups, which bring that idea of a routine, you know, to something that happens frequently in order to help the students reflect and develop resources and to get to know new strategies in order to reflect upon the learning that they have. So we know that it is not always possible to have a simple reading of our minds, you know, for the students to read our minds and know what we want them to learn. So we provoke them to reflect themselves about their own learning experiences and about the steps of this process. So this makes everything more evident for us. Another instrument that we use quite a lot when we talk about this evaluation for learning, this assessment for learning, is the use of rubrics. So we have some criteria here. In the first line, we have some of the criteria. So for instance, if I'm working with a student, let's say the reading of news articles. So let's say I want the student to use trustworthy sources, and I want them to research about news regarding this topic, or I want them to interpret the text from a news outlet, and I want them to synthesize the ideas. And what we stimulate the teachers to do, in addition to this, is to deliver this back to the student before they start the activity. So it is not something for you to correct the student only, but it is also for you to follow up with the student. And it has different levels, right? So you have the basic, initial, very basic, and then intermediate and advanced level. So how can you deal with an intermediate or advanced use of news outlets and trustworthy outlets? So the idea is to register how the student behaves in each one of those criteria in order to initially discuss with them about those subjects, in order to foster that self-assessment and to make the student responsible for their own process as well. Not only something that the teacher will do for the students. And we have to think about strategies for the classroom. So this book that was inspired in blended learning for the United States, we have many strategies in order to form new groupings of new production groupings. So for instance, I can have heterogeneous work groups, just like Chris said, so the students can help themselves, can help each other to reach an objective. Or in a given class, I can form homogeneous groups so that I can get closer to the students that are more advanced and help them advance further. Or maybe even those initial steps of those students, those beginners that need more support from the professor, for instance. And maybe the intermediate students can also assess themselves and so forth and so on. So This is when we understand the relevance of customizing the experience, and we advocate for that, which is much more than individualize the process, but actually designing the learning experiences so that all of the students can be contemplated by this process. So this view of personalizing and customizing that with the design of the experience itself, much more than just a class for each student, which would be the individualization view. And why is that? Because we believe that during this process, we believe that, and we agree with what Chris just mentioned, is that during this process, the student will more and more learn about how to self-assess and how to design their own resources. So they will say, well, I have questions about this point or the other point, or maybe this is something I really understand well, so I can help others, and so forth. And to finish off, in order for us to have some Q&A, I try to be very concise here. I just wanted to share with you this website here, which is the ligasteam.com.br. So here we have some publications about those experiences of STEAM in public schools, and initially with students that are younger, so from 4 to 11 years of age, which is the majority here, but still working to train the teachers in the final years and in middle school and so forth. So here I have two references. We have my book here, STEAM in the Classroom, and also Bender's book, which is about the project-based learning, which is a very important and very interesting reference for us. And this is my social networks, and I'm completely open now for Q&A, and I will pass on the word to Arthur again. Thank you.
Lilian, thank you so much. This was so inspiring. I mean, really, really great to listen to you. Thank you very much. I want to see whether people would like to ask questions. If Chris Harris would like to ask any question first. If not, I have questions myself to ask the two of you. Let's see if Chris would like to start off, kick off with questions. Would you, Chris, please?
Thank you very much, Lilian. That was so interesting and so many parallels with what we found through our work on assessment for learning, particularly this age aspect, that primary students actually probably are doing it better than secondary. And I think that's to do with the teachers more so. I mean, it's partly to do with learners and the stage they're at in terms of interacting with one another, but I think it's because the teachers maybe work slightly differently, and we've got a lot to learn from primary teachers, I think, in the secondary sector. What I would like to ask, because as you were talking, it reminded me of the two projects that my team did, two European Union projects. One was SAILS and the other one was Assist Me, which was looking at assessment within STEM. And the idea of actually approaching the learning through projects, do you think this actually helps build this sort of does it encourage students to want to learn and to ask questions more, because you are taking a more project-based approach and having to have assessment goes with that, than maybe the sorts of STEM lessons where we just go through doing, you know, lesson to lesson? A project maybe links it up better.
Well, for us, when we started studying STEM and STEAM, it was always difficult for us to understand what could better support the teachers so that they could establish connections within the classroom and the subjects and the several subjects. I'm sorry, ma'am, she's frozen. At the beginning, they are multidisciplinary teachers here that we have in Brazil, and they teach mathematics, history, geography. They teach many subjects, the arts, and even so, the knowledge, they were in silos. Now we're going to teach math. Now we're going to teach history. And we felt that with the projects, we were able to better make the students establish these connections between the several fields of knowledge. And they had this transdisciplinary knowledge beyond the subjects to solve problems. So when they started solving problems, and as often as possible, problems connected to their real lives, to their communities, to their interests, they want to solve problems. How can I build a rocket to go to the moon? Sometimes they wanted to do that. And so sometimes you're not going to be able to reach the moon, as these students were able to renovate that dump, yes? So once they are connected to real problems, to larger problems, this gives them this sensation that they are doing something that is not only to present to a teacher, but something that makes sense to them, to their communities. So we have been finding results with secondary students creating prototypes, creating artifacts, and the results are very interesting. Even learning related to social, emotional, and economic areas. There was a student in the secondary school, and he had a colleague, a classmate who was an autistic, and this student was very, very disturbed by noises. So they tried to develop an artifact that when the noise in the classroom went over what they have established, and that student didn't feel comfortable anymore, there was a light that was switched on, and then the entire class had to diminish the noise. And this is very, very interesting, because they had to study physics, electronics, many areas of technology, engineering, physics, to solve a real problem of a classroom that had a classmate that needed the support from the class. And so it became more meaningful to them, and so they learned more.
Great. I have a few comments and questions here. Oh, sorry, Chris. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was going to just follow on for that. So we found similar that the teachers and the students actually became more active in their learning, but our teachers then found the assessment more difficult, because assessment of building a rocket to the moon is very different to assessment of doing the light coming on for the student. And so that actually became a sort of barrier. We had to work very hard. And like you, we tried to focus them on learning objectives and maybe to take a more rubric approach to assessment, which is not something we would normally do here in the UK. Do your teachers find the assessment side of the learning difficult in that type of project work?
Muito mais difícil.
Yes, and they thought it was way more difficult. Our main challenge now, when we train our teachers based on STEAM, is to have a few classes to train them. Sorry, she froze again.
De avaliação, acho que
to have an assessment. Yes, my internet was cut off. And so we give them some classes only discussing the assessment with them. Because in fact, we are talking about assessment in any school, but we have to think about this once again, because there is a huge difficulty, not only on the part of the teachers, but on the part of the students, because the older the students are, they ask us, is this going to be on my test? Is this worthwhile? Should I really do this? So we have to change the culture that means assessment. Yes, for sure, it was way more difficult.
Yeah.
Same with us.
I would like to ask one question, Lillian, as well, about the thinking routines that you refer to. and linking that to online learning. I have been using that in my own teaching, and I've been finding extremely powerful to get the students to reflect, obviously, on their learning, but also to find out more about how they are learning. So I found that using digital tools in particular, where we could record what they've been discussing and what they've been the ideas that come up with, helped me to provide them with better feedback, because I got to know a lot better how they were, how they were learning. How do you use that? How do you think in routines? Do you use that at the end of the lesson only, at the middle of the lesson? I've been using at the middle and at the end, a bit both. But how do you use, and how do you record them? How do you provide the feedback to the students? I would like to learn more from you in that respect, please.
Muito obrigada, Arthur, pela pergunta.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arthur, for my question. And I would like to mention that one teacher that took our training courses here, her name is Juliane Oliveira. And she mentioned, she said, yes, it's very difficult to assess. And she has been using the thinking routine, but she felt that the students were struggling. So we have a feedback from one of the teachers we trained. Arthur, the thinking routines, they support us a lot at different moments. I have noticed that in some moments they work as an identification of previous knowledge that the student has. So things that the younger students, they bring to us as experiences, learning experiences from previous years, everything that the students are interested in. So many times we want to start a project with them, or a class that is not a project, a regular or traditional class, and we want to use a thinking routine, and this helps them to visualize even more what they know, topic that they know, what they would like to know more. So there's a routine that we use a lot at the beginning. I know, I want to know, I would like to know. KWL in English. And this thinking routine is widely used at the beginning of the class or before the class. It's used before the class, what I know about this topic, what I would like to know about this topic, and at the end of the process, what I truly learned. And so this moment is a cognitive goal. The students are going to stop to find out what they know. Oh, I advanced on this topic. Oh, this topic was more difficult for me. Or what the student shares with us, what he or she learned was sometimes even not our goal or objective. And the side effect is that the students, they learned something that was not part of our goals. And that's very interesting. And that's why we are teachers. We wanted the learning to be as comprehensive as possible. So at the beginning, it works really well. But the greatest challenge, Arthur, is the registration of this, is recording all of this. Marcos made a comment. There is a link here in the chat box. There is a specific book. Oh, I have a copy of this book, Cultures of Thinking in Action. And I'm reading this book now. And it was written by this author, Mr. Ron. And these are materials that are very recent, and they offer suggestions. And the greatest challenge is this registration or recording, Arthur, okay? So I say that it's a huge challenge because it's a challenge for the teacher to have many individual registrations or recordings, analyzing these recordings. So more and more the digital technology should be used to support our process. So let's imagine that we have a mural and we use this. All of the information is there on the mural, on the board. I can see the one that my classmate wrote. I can write my own, because the learning process is a process that can count on the collective, but it's basically individual. I am going to learn something. something. I am going to learn something during this process. So all of this registration or recording is a challenge. And I would like to discuss something that I love. Thinking routines can be used before, during the class with a collective gathering of information, and then after the class, with a perspective of analyzing what was learned, the learning, and also supporting the teacher to replan his lessons or her lessons. So we are training our teachers with that. How can we use all of these data to rethink, to replan a future class?
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Lillian. So I have a couple of people asking questions on the chat. They are Brazil specific, let's put this way. Like let me see if I get some questions that are more international questions that could interest everyone here. So someone asked, how can we hang on. Yeah, Claudia asked, how can we make STEAM education inclusive and how to make it work? This is a very good question, but I don't know the extent to which it's related to AFL, to Assessment for Learning. Just let me see if I can get one question that perhaps is more like so Fabio asked which book presents thinking routines. It's the one that you have just shown. Is that right? Professor Marcos asked, good afternoon, everyone. How do you perceive STEAM initiatives in the new Brazilian high school? But let's try to address this question more openly. Like, how do you see STEAM initiatives in school? Maybe let me see if we can get another question. Yeah. Yeah, for now, maybe that's the question. Sorry, I will try to get another question shortly, okay?
But by team initiatives, do you mean sort of group work, Arthur? Is that what it means?
STEAM, no, STEAM, like STEAM, STEM with the A for arts.
Okay.
Yeah, so let me ask the question again, sorry. It says, how do you perceive, how do you understand the STEAM initiatives, like, so how to bring science, technology, engineering, arts, math together in school, in the new Brazilian high school? That's the question, the original question, Lillian or Chris. To know if it's something that you'd be able to talk about.
Antes de eu responder essa pergunta, eu queria perguntar para
Before answering this question, I would like to ask Professor Chris about the presence of STEM or STEAM in the secondary schools in the UK, because based on the knowledge that we have regarding the assessments, we are also concerned regarding the students that are wrapping up secondary education with the tests, with the assessments. Is it possible to have the STEAM going beyond the STUGs? I think she said hubs or STUGs. We have been using STEAM in the regular classes, not in a club, not in a knowledge club, not in a specific club. If I want to do this activity during the regular classes, not only within the clubs. So is it possible to have this for all of the students? Chris, is this possible? Does this happen? Does this happen at a few schools? And then I'm going to share my experience here in Brazil. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, so it's possible. Is it happening? Not so much. So really, our curriculum, since we moved to a national curriculum, really over 35 years ago, has been much more in these separate disciplinary silos. So there's science, there's maths, they're all separate. However, there have been times where we've tried to bring them more together, and more recently STEM and STEAM to some extent has been tried in some schools. how it tends to happen is that there are maybe set days, maybe once or twice a term, when they might have a whole day put over to doing a STEM or STEAM project. And so it's all worked on, but it still tends to be, the knowledge still tends to be more isolated within the subjects. It might just be a common topic going through, that they're all working on. It's just that they're working on it from a mathematics perspective or from a science perspective or whatever they're doing. So they might do conservation, but they might look at it in English from an arts view of actually having magazine articles, or in art they might have posters, and in mathematics they might start looking at some of the data, but a lot of it will still be within science. So there are bits like that, and certainly I know from the work that's been done by some of our teachers and educators who are on our STEM Masters course here at King's. We are the only university in the UK who are doing a STEM Masters course, and we have some of those who are here on the master's course specifically because they want to actually integrate it more, to bring it together more. And some of them have been working on ideas on that, researching what are some of the hurdles that you have to overcome to bring that in, but also what are some of the benefits. So I think that we will learn from that. I know at the Association for Science Education conference this January, there are some teachers talking about taking that forward. So I would say we have small pockets of STEM and STEAM going on here in the UK. But I think teachers, particularly after the pandemic, are still so worried about what we call learning recovery, filling those gaps within their own discipline, that they're maybe not quite ready to move forward with that yet. But I think teachers aspire to do it. They would like to do it in some schools.
Que bom, que ótimo ter essas notícias.
Excellent. How wonderful to receive these news. Here in Brazil, Cláudia even wrote in the chat box here, we also face many difficulties in implementing in our secondary schools, mainly in our public schools. Our public schools, they receive most of our students that we have in Brazil, and it's difficult for them, not only because of the lack of infrastructure, but also because of a post-pandemic scenario. We are facing the same learning difficulties because of the pandemic, and also the new secondary education. It is a new secondary education that the students can choose their pathways. So we had a national pedagogical book program 3 years ago, in which the teachers, they would be able to choose pedagogical books, teaching books, project books, and some of these books, they had some steps to follow, the step by step, so that they could carry out a STEAM project with their students inside the classrooms. So they are specific projects, but there is the possibility of developing this in the elective subjects, in other moments, at other moments. So it's not going to be outside the curriculum. It's going to be for a regular class, but depending on the choices that the students are going to make, and you can go deep down in some of the subjects. So I see a high potential for secondary schools, mainly when we analyze issues regarding how to develop scientific thinking, creativity, communication. And when we analyze one of the elements that for us is new, which is life projects, beyond thinking about which career am I going to follow, no, but life projects involving self-awareness, getting to know your peers better, getting to know your society as a whole in a more critical way, so that you can make choices not only based on your career, but your relationship with learning. How do I intend to relate myself with learning now that I am 15, 16, 17 years old, and maybe this is the moment that I have to make my choices. My parents are not going to choose for me. I'm going to have to make my own decisions. So I see a high potential, but I believe that besides the infrastructure that is very serious, the teacher training for us is a critical point.
And we lastly have been having many public discussions about the training of teachers, and the online universe comes into this spot of criticism sometimes when we do have some courses which are exclusively online, and they not always have the same quality as a good in-person course. So the discussion goes along the lines of how to better train professors, because if we don't have better professors, it's not worth to just compulsively use STEAM in the classroom.
Very good, thank you. Let me see if there are other people who'd like to ask further questions, or obviously at any time if Chris or Lillian would like to ask other questions or make comments. Let me ask if the audience, we still have 31 people with us, if whether they want to ask any other question to Chris or Lillian, or both. Yeah, okay. I think then we can come to an end to our event today. Obviously, I know that we could carry on talking for a lot more time, but I think it can give us a very good overview of what Lillian has been doing in Brazil, what Chris has been doing in the UK. I mean, one of the objectives that we have for the STEM Education Hub is to build bridges between Brazil and the UK. That's a clear objective that we have in this project. So obviously, we'd love to see Chris maybe going to Brazil, or Lillian coming to the UK one day, or doing some work together. And those who are here as participants, please make sure that you visit our website. In our website, we have videos and resources from previous events. So it's the hub. The idea of the hub, as the name is given, because we want people to meet there and go away, do the projects, do the research, or do the teaching. So we want to bring people together to get to know better what they do, how they do it. So make sure that you go to our website and access all that we have. Our website is stemeducationhub.co.uk. It's on the chat, and these presentations today is being recorded, so we are going to then later put the app on our website as well. Okay. Can I thank you again very, very much indeed for Chris and Lillian to come to join us today and do this presentation. I'm sure everyone loved it. And thank you for all those who could attend today. I've got people from the UK and Brazil I can see here in the chat, and it's great that all of you could attend today. Thank you so much indeed. Keep in touch with us. And if Chris or Lillian want to say anything before we go away, obviously please do. Or Claudia as well, if you want to say anything, please do before we can finish today.
I just want to say thank you, and it's reassuring hearing that the sort of problems that we're finding and working on are also being worked on in Brazil, because it's together that we start to find these solutions. And it's amazing how just being able to reflect what you're doing within another culture helps you rethink ways forward for moving with this. So certainly today, and going back to those thinking routines that Lillian was talking about, we've used similar-ish things here in the UK. I think we maybe need to do more of that. So thank you very much for that, Lillian. I will be using that probably with our new teachers as we work with them, but also I've got a project with primary school teachers at the moment, Science Ninjas, which we'll maybe use it in as well. So thank you very much for that. It's been very useful. And thank you, Arthur Obrigado, for actually putting this together, because I've actually found it really stimulating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. Great.
Eu também gostaria de agradecer, Cris,
I would also like to say thank you because I really did learn quite a lot from what you shared about the whole history of the assessment for learning. And this is always something that we have to dedicate time for. And I'm very glad to see that our challenges are rather similar too. And the more we learn from each other with the challenges, and using the peer learning, you know, as we very well said during the discussion, we can also build joint ways forward for us to follow. So it was a great opportunity to exchange with Chris. She's a great reference in this area. It's an honor for me. And thank you, Arthur, for the opportunity. And thank you to the Education Hub, because this is how we grow, you know, exchanging as educators and being together. So thank you so very much for this invitation and for this opportunity.
Right, okay. So thank you again, everyone, to stay with us today. I hope to see you again soon. And that's all from us, okay? Thank you, Claudia, for the organization as well. And Cleo and Andrea for organizing everything. There is a huge amount of work behind this. And they, you know, these people have been doing a wonderful job. So thank you so much indeed for everyone to come today and for the organization as well. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.